In a village where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely survived sundown, one woman returned not to stir trouble, but to quietly dig up a truth, long thought buried. No gunshots, no screams, just a single glove, a cup of tea, and a name no one had dared to question. Until now. What if the real danger wasn't a murderer hiding in plain sight, but the fear of what exposing him might cost? Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't revenge. It was something far more haunting. Miss Henrietta Bloom was delicately pruning the edges of her sage and lavender planters on the moss-lined windowsill of Rosebend Cottage, when the solemn chimes of St. Luke's clock tower echoed across Dunmore Hollow, striking 10 with a strange echoing finality, as though time itself had paused to listen. Sunlight filtered through the tangled ivy climbing her garden wall, scattering golden shards across the cobblestone path below, where drowsy bees staggered from one blossom to the next, their hum oddly dissonant. The morning air carried a faint chill despite the sun, and with it came an unusual scent, sweet but singed, like overcooked jam or burnt toffee, drifting faintly from Mrs. Glanville's open kitchen window next door. That in itself was strange. Mrs. Glanville was meticulous, almost obsessively so. Henrietta paused, her pruning shears mid-air, head tilting slightly. Something about the air felt off, not wrong in any obvious way, but subtly misaligned, like a photograph hung a degree too crooked to ignore. Life in Dunmore Hollow prided itself on stillness and order. Fences were freshly painted. Tea was poured at precisely 4. Secrets, if they existed, came gift-wrapped in polite smiles and were buried just beneath perfectly raked gravel paths. But Henrietta Bloom had lived too long and seen too much to be fooled by surface calm. Behind every closed curtain, behind every overly bright greeting, there was something unsaid, and it was always on such perfectly undisturbed mornings that the cracks began to show. That afternoon the village hall beside Luke's was filled with the rustle of starched skirts, the creak of folding chairs, and the soft anticipatory coughs of Dunmore's most respectable citizens. The spring recital, hosted annually by the Ladies' Benevolence Guild, was expected to be as uneventful as it was dutiful. Lemon polish clung to the floorboards. A few dry scones were stacked unenthusiastically near the rear table beside a pot of overbrewed tea. Henrietta entered quietly, choosing her usual seat near the back, far enough to remain unnoticed, close enough to see everything. Her gaze scanned the room, familiar with every villager's routine, every tick, every well-worn path of behavior. And that's when she noticed her, the woman in the third row. Unfamiliar, motionless, almost frozen. She wore a severe navy coat, a stiff grey skirt, polished shoes that reflected the hall's dull lighting, and a wide-brimmed black hat with an outdated veil draped just enough to obscure her features. In her lap rested a single black silk glove, folded with deliberate precision. She did not look around, did not sip the tea set beside her, did not adjust her seat or glance at the program in her lap. She simply sat, rigid and eerie, as though she had not arrived but had been placed there. When Miss Glazier, the anxious schoolmistress, began her rendition of Chopin's Nocturne, the hall fell quiet. The music tiptoed gently through the dust-speckled air, climbing and dipping in fragile waves, and still the woman did not move. Not a shift of posture, not a twitch. Henrietta's breath slowed as she leaned in slightly, sensing something far more serious than nerves. As the final note lingered and dissolved into silence, the room erupted into the usual polite, restrained applause, except the woman made no gesture, not a flicker of acknowledgement. Miss Glazier bowed, glanced at the audience, then did a double take. She wasn't the only one. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Miss Carnaby," he called with quiet hesitation that somehow made the question more chilling. No response, no blink, just that awful sculpted stillness. And then someone gasped, a single sharp sound that tore the veil of calm. Others followed with murmurs, shuffling uneasily. No one approached, no one dared. It was clear now the woman was dead, had been dead the entire time. Her posture hadn't faltered. Her teacup, still full, sat untouched, the steam long vanished. The glove in her lap hadn't fallen, it had been placed there. The air in the room thickened, turning from polite discomfort to visceral unease. Henrietta moved forward slowly, her gaze fixed not just on the body, but the deliberate choices surrounding it. The positioning, the clothing, the untouched drink, the glove too perfect to be accidental. Something was wrong intentionally, intricately wrong. The vicar's wife stumbled forward, pale and shaking, murmuring nonsense about the raffle. Constable fellows arrived within minutes, herding the stunned villagers out of the room with awkward apologies. Yet the sense of something unfinished lingered like a shadow across their backs as they left. Outside under the stark sunlight, people whispered and speculated, but Henrietta remained silent. She leaned casually against the church garden wall, nodding here and there, but her mind was racing. The woman hadn't cried out, there'd been no disturbance, no visible wound, just music, and then death. But not ordinary death. It was too neat, too theatrical. Not a scene of panic but of message. Someone had wanted this discovery to unfold precisely as it had. Henrietta's fingers brushed her shawl as her eyes returned to the door of the church hall. Behind that door she felt it. A note that hadn't been played, but was humming just beneath the silence, dark and dissonant. And whoever had composed it wasn't finished. Not yet. The morning at Elderbank was unusually hushed, wrapped in a kind of silence that felt purposeful rather than peaceful, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. And it was during this silence, just after the post had arrived but before the bell from Morwen's rang out, that Miss Celia Hargrave noticed the brass door knocker at Larkspur House was missing. A small thing, easily dismissed, but in Celia's experience, it was always the smallest things that signaled something larger unraveling beneath the surface. The house itself, an ivy-swathed old relic, standing slightly back from the lane, had sat empty for a decade, shuttered by inheritance disputes and quiet rumors of bad air or worse luck, until just last week when the pale, reclusive Miss Eloise Crane took up residence with no announcement, no visit held in a single black suitcase. Now barely days into her return, her name was being whispered in corners again, not with gossip but with weariness. That morning the village postmaster, a usually jovial man with a nose for stories, had found a letter unaddressed, unsealed, wedged oddly behind the gatepost of the churchyard. Inside was a pressed marigold, brittle and old, wrapped in paper from a local ledger dated 9. No one knew what to make of it, until the verger, trembling and pale, recalled that marigolds were the favorite flower of Eleanor Dovey, the schoolmistress, who had vanished without a trace during the Great War, and whose last known address, strangely enough, had also been Larkspur House. That night, Miss Hargrave attended a modest gathering at the village library, ostensibly a poetry reading, though the talk as always curled toward the strange, with Mrs. Penrose speculating in a low voice that Eloise was the granddaughter of Eleanor Dovey, and had come to settle some unnamed score. A hush fell as the clock struck 8, and into that hush came a figure tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes, and a veil too dark for fashion, who paused at the threshold, only long enough for every cup of tea to go cold and every breath to catch before she stepped inside and offered no name. But it wasn't until the following morning that the true tremor struck the village, when young Daniel Cray, who delivered milk before dawn, found the front door of Larkspur wide open, a trail of marigold petals leading from the threshold, through the sitting room and ending in front of a grand piano whose lid was half lifted, as though someone had just finished playing and left in a hurry. No sign of Miss Crane remained, only a single velvet glove, child-sized, resting atop the piano lid, and an open hymnal on the bench with a photograph tucked inside, faint and yellowing, of Eleanor Dovey as a young girl standing beside a man in uniform with the same ice-gray eyes Miss Crane had. Miss Hargrave called to the scene with quiet urgency, examined the items with deliberate care, noting the faint scent of rosewater, and the subtle smear of soot on the windowsill, as though someone had tried to enter or escape through the chimney of all things. And then, as she turned to leave, her gaze caught on the mantel clock still ticking steadily, and yet showing a time nearly an hour ahead of the real one, a minor detail but enough to trouble her. In villages like Elderbank, secrets didn't shout, they pulsed gently beneath polite conversation, crept along under doors, and sometimes took nearly a lifetime to surface. But this one Celia felt with a mounting chill, wasn't content to stay buried. The items weren't random, the time discrepancy, the hymn book, the trail of petals, the unsealed letter. It was choreography, not chaos. Someone had orchestrated this, and someone else, perhaps even one of them sipping tea and speculating innocently the day before, knew exactly how this would unfold. What haunted Celia most wasn't the absence of Elowen Crane, but the strange sense that she hadn't vanished at all, that she was still in the house, somewhere behind the walls or beneath the floorboards, watching, waiting, listening for something, or someone to finish the story she had only just begun. Zera Hollow was one of those villages that time hadn't quite let go of, a place suspended between the echoes of history and the silences that follow. Cobblestone paths curled like secrets through mossy fences, and the church bells still rang every Sunday with a kind of stubborn memory. But the morning Elise Vernon appeared, seated alone in the third pew of Winifred's, dressed in dark wool and wrapped in a stillness that seemed practiced, the air shifted, just a little, like the moment before a storm. She introduced herself with politeness, offered a name that seemed too polished, too rehearsed, and asked questions that raised eyebrows in the vicar's study. Not about births, nor deaths, nor marriages as visitors usually did, but about wartime visitors, guest logs from the 1940s, particularly not who belonged to Zera Hollow, but who had merely passed through. It was an odd request, curious, impersonal, and far too deliberate. Miss Anika Darby, once a schoolmistress but now known as the village's quiet compass of intuition, was returning a teacup when she overheard Elise's inquiry. She stayed seated, knitting needles idle in her lap, watching with the stillness of a cat before pound. Elise's interest wasn't in heritage, it was in movements, arrivals, disappearances. That night at the church recital, Elise was again present, her eyes not on the choir but scanning the faces in the crowd like a detective cataloguing suspects. She asked subtle questions. Who was still living at Fernstead Estate? Had the old boundary paths been changed? Had anyone ever rebuilt the bomb shelter that once stood behind the chapel? But the real tremor began with young Ilona, the housemaid taken in by the vicar's family last winter, said to be from the East, Hungary or Lithuania, depending on who you are. She was quiet, obedient and unnaturally pale, with eyes that always looked down and hands that sometimes trembled when no one was speaking to her. Ever since Elise's arrival, she'd grown quieter, flinching at the sound of her name, avoiding the chapel's western corridor, where the visitor books were kept. Some whispered that Ilona had seen, but Miss Darby suspected differently. Ilona had survived something, yes, but now feared it had returned in human form. Then came the map, a yellowed scrap discovered folded and hidden inside a hollowed-out hymnal by the rector's wife, who thought at first it was a child's game. But the map was no game. It bore coordinates in neat, dated ink. One particular red X marked the roots of the ancient oak behind the church, roots rumored to have grown crooked since the war. Miss Darby had long heard the story whispered between the lines of Zera Hollow's history, of a child, Timothy Wexler, who vanished during a harvest festival in 1943, last seen chasing fireflies near that very oak. Officially he'd wandered off and drowned, but no one had ever found a body, and no one ever truly believed the tale. Elise Vernon had asked about him by name. When Anika gently mentioned this to Mr. Gibbons the vicar, his hand trembled enough to spill tea onto the sauce. Must have read about it in an archive, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. But Anika wasn't convinced, nor was she convinced when Miss Braithwaite, the groundskeeper, mentioned how the earth beneath the oak had once been dug up, hastily, under cover of darkness, then replanted as if nothing had happened. And the more she listened, the more she understood. Elise Vernon had not returned to mourn or remember. She had returned to unearth. She was seeking something buried in both soil and silence. And someone very close by, was beginning to realize that whatever they had once hidden so deeply, might finally be uncovered. The villagers, too polite to question, were beginning to feel the chill of recognition. And even Ilona, whose nightmares had returned with whispers in her sleep, was beginning to look at Elise not with fear but with guilt, not her own perhaps but inherited, witness, the kind of guilt that lives long in the blood of survivors. Something had happened in Zera Hollow, During those blacked-out war years, something no one had dared to speak aloud in decades, and now that silence was cracking like old plaster, each question Elise asked was a chisel to the wall. Miss Darby sat by the hearth that night, the fire crackling low, and wrote a single name in her diary. Elise Vernon. Not here for memory. Here for truth. And as the wind howled outside like it hadn't in years, she knew truth had a way of surfacing, especially when it was no longer willing to stay buried. It began innocently, as so many things in Hemsbury Vale often did, with a question too mundane to feel threatening. Mrs. Edna Calloway, widow of a railway man and known for her floral aprons and precise knitting, had asked Dr. Halbert during his weekly circuit through the village about a vaccination schedule for her grandniece's newborn. But behind her reading glasses, Edna's eyes flickered too quickly toward the surgery door, and before long the conversation, seemingly harmless, wandered into deeper waters. "Strange business," Dr. Halbert murmured, removing his spectacles and beginning to polish them with a tremor he didn't acknowledge. "No known conditions, no alerts on file. She never registered with my practice officially, just lodged briefly above Mrs. Linley's bakery. A fleeting stay, and then," he paused, "a sudden passing. No forewarning. Frankly, I find it troubling." Seated beside Edna with a posture as unassuming as a lace doily but eyes sharp as frost, Miss Camberley asked gently. "No indication of cardiac trouble?" Dr. Halbert frowned at the phrasing. "Possible, yes, but there were no red flags, no high blood pressure, no history of strain, no visible signs. I met her once at the harvest fete. She struck me as self-contained, composed," Camber murmured, her tone unreadable, perhaps resolved. The doctor glanced at her, intrigued. "Possibly, though resolution and resignation, well, they carry very different weights." He dismissed them shortly after, but Camber's mind caught on that distinction like a pinhook snagging silk. Later that afternoon, the scent of dust and forgotten ink guided Camber to the record room adjoining the Hemsbury Vale Library, a modest stone building where time seemed to pool in the corners, and whispers lived between pages. Mrs. Beatrice Nolan, the keeper of the archive since VA Day, greeted her with the affection reserved for those who respected paper more than people. They chatted about worn bindings, the town's fading census logs, and a curious old map with a creek drawn where no water now flowed. Then Camber asked almost too casually whether any unfamiliar names had been signed in the borrower's register recently. Beatrice hesitated, her expression taut with memory. There was a Lillian Moorcroft, checked out a book on herbal remedies, and oddly one on Cold War disappearances. Peculiar pair. But what startled me was the name. I hadn't heard it in years. She used to be Lillian Haraway, evacuated here during the Blitz, lived with the Dench family. Quiet girl, polite, but scared. Not of war, mind you, of something else, something closer. She dropped her voice. One June she vanished. Everyone said she'd gone back to London, but no one ever saw her leave. That evening, with the mist rising like breath from the moors, Camberley walked the winding lane toward Dench Farm carrying a jar of preserves she claimed were from her orchard. Though Joseph Dench knew better, she never brought gifts without reason. They sat beneath the skeletal branches of an elm tree. As twilight deepened, the silence between them shaped by shared decades and unspoken understanding. "You knew her," Camber said at last. Joseph's eyes were fixed on the fence line. "Lillian," he said, "my brother was to marry her. She was delicate, but not weak, and something haunted her. She'd flinch at sounds no one else heard. In '44 she disappeared. No letter, no goodbye, just silence. I heard rumors she went back to London, but I never believed it. Not really." His voice thinned like mist through hedgerows. "I kept the cellar light on for years. Stupid thing. Habit. Maybe." Camber watched him, her voice gentler now. "She came back, didn't she?" Joseph's hand clenched on his knee. "Yes, last week, at dusk. She wore the same grey coat." Her voice hadn't changed. "She stood where the lilac tree used to be and said she wasn't safe yet. Said she had something to tell me. But not yet. She asked me if the cellar still had the trapdoor. I told her yes. She said the full moon was coming, that it would be time soon. His voice dropped to a high. She looked over her shoulder before she left, like someone was watching. Camber felt the air shift heavy, charged as if history itself was holding its breath. Did she come back last night? She asked. Joseph shook his head. Not yet. They sat in silence, and across the hedge a crow called once, then fell silent. Camber's heart beat slow and deep in her chest. Lillian hadn't returned out of nostalgia nor for peace. Something had driven her back to this quiet, unremarkable village. Something older than war, older than love. And that cellar, long since forgotten by most, was not just a relic of wartime sheltering. It had hidden something, or someone. And tonight, under the full moon, Lillian Moorcroft, or Lillian Haraway if one remembered correctly, intended to open what had once been closed, perhaps for good reason. Camber stood smoothing her coat. Joseph, she said, her voice low, if she knocks tonight, don't answer until I'm standing beside you. The wind that morning was strange, not fierce or cold but oddly intentional, as if it carried whispers too old to belong to any living throat, twisting between the hedgerows like something once buried clawing its way back to air. Clara Brathwaite paused midway through her walk to the grocer's, the familiar rhythm of her steps broken by a smell she hadn't sensed in decades. Old lavender, singed wool and something beneath it, like iron left out in the rain. It came from the direction of Merryweather Cottage, long abandoned, the slate roof warped by seasons and sorrow alike. Her eyes caught the faintest flicker in one of its high windows. Not movement, but the suggestion that someone had moved and was now still. She said nothing, but her hand tightened on the basket's handle. Later that day, whispers thickened in the village like storm clouds over the fields. Someone had returned. A woman, unnaturally quiet, older than the girl who had disappeared 20 years ago, but with the same unmistakable eyes, had come asking about parish records, inheritance lists, sealed deeds and land that had once been promised but never passed. Mrs. Kendrick, ever observant behind her tea-room counter, described the woman's stare as one that had seen something it wasn't supposed to forget. No one dared say the name aloud, but all thought it Eloise Merryweather. And then at the edge of memory, things began to shift. The vicar's candle ledger was disturbed. 3 entries missing from October 9. Miss Delia, who had kept house for the magistrate, found an envelope behind the spice cupboard marked, to be opened only if she returned. And the boy from the bakery who swore he saw the woman by the war memorial near midnight, claimed she wasn't alone. She was speaking to someone, he whispered, but there wasn't anyone there. 2 days later her body was found folded like sleep had overtaken her, on the wet edge of Blackheath Moor, hands tucked beneath her head as if she had simply lain down to rest. No marks. No struggle. Just open eyes and a faint smile, like she'd finally heard the answer to a question no one else knew had been asked. Dr. Kettle ruled it heart failure, but Clara knew better. There are ways to die that the heart understands before the mind ever catches up. But what unnerved Clara most was what came after. The silence that followed Eloise's death wasn't grief, but fear. Files vanished from the town office. 2 names were scrubbed from the Cooper estate's ownership logs. Miss Eleanor Hawthorne, whose family had once lived across from the Merryweather land, admitted in a voice thick with regret that not all absences were accidental. She was supposed to be forgotten, she said, hands shaking as she folded an old telegram into her apron. But forgotten people don't always stay buried. And still the wind circled, pressing against windows and chimneys, as if reminding the village that it had once chosen silence, and silence like soil can preserve more than it erases. On the last Sunday of the month Clara walked past the chapel again, and found the door ajar. Inside, there were petals scattered along the aisle, dried, crumbling and unmistakably lavender. A single note lay on the pulpit unsigned but unmistakable. The truth was always here. You just buried it with the wrong body. And Clara, feeling the cold settle into her bones, realized the story wasn't over. It was only just waking up. They said she was a stranger. Yet there was something about the way she walked through Darnley on Thorn unhurried, quietly measuring each stone path and leaning gate, as if she were not discovering the village but confronting it. Her coat, worn and travel-dulled, clung to her frame like a curtain, hiding history, while the scent she left behind, bergamot mixed with dry paper and distant winter, felt like a memory no one quite recognized. But all felt uneasy about. Children stopped playing when she passed. Dogs fell silent and older villagers lowered their eyes, unsure why her presence stirred a kind of unease that had nothing to do with present time. Miss Ellesmere, the sharp-eared spinster with an unspoken past of her own, swore she saw the woman pause at the war memorial not in mourning but with an expression that flickered between familiarity and disappointment. And then only hours later came the first tremor. Word from the baker's wife that the woman had visited the vestry, asking about visitor records from the night. She had said she was tracing her family's residence during the war years, but her questions had a pointedness to them delicately placed, yet too precise to be mere curiosity. And when Miss Annis, retired archivist, quiet observer, and chronicler of things left unsaid, heard mention of a missing page in the chapel register, her instincts stirred. Torn, the curate's widow had said, slicing sponge cake with a distracted hand, neatly at the binding. Probably a child. But children did not remove records with surgical precision, and the page in question was no trivial leaf. It was from the exact week the woman claimed her family had once arrived. A page that, had it remained, might have shown a name now lost in reinvention. Miss Annis kept her silence, but her thoughts began connecting. Names unspoken, faces nearly remembered, and the quiet panic that had begun to ripple across the village like wind across an old pond. That night, under cover of dusk, she visited the old vicarage and found Mira the maid, young but with eyes that knew more than they showed, polishing silver with trembling fingers. The girl admitted she had seen the woman before. Her name was Anya then. She whispered. She was kind. Not from here. She helped people, and once she told the truth when no one else would. Mira's voice faltered. There was a man. He carried someone else's papers. Anya reported him quietly to the Red Cross, and the next day she was gone. Miss Annis understood. The past had not simply returned. It had come to correct itself. What had been buried in official silence was now rising, quiet but undeniable. Anya Varga, now calling herself Mrs. Kestrel, had come not to accuse but to undo a wrong that had cost lives and fate. But someone else remembered too, and feared what she might reveal. A missing page, a name erased, a folded glove left in the chapel, embroidered with initials that hadn't been seen since the winter. Then came the fire. It did not start in a cottage or a barn, but in the records annex behind the chapel, where files lay untouched for years under padlock and dust. The blaze rose fast and clean, a scholar's fire, targeting knowledge. Miss Calder, the librarian who had catalogued every book in the village by scent and touch alone, said she had smelled petrol hours before the alarm. She had not reported it. I thought it might be the vicar's car leaking, she said later, her voice thick with shame. But when the flames reached the shelf marked 1940-1950, Eleanor was already there, silent, composed, her eyes fixed on the blackening wood as if watching a verdict handed down. She did not move. She did not scream. When the firemen arrived, she handed one a photograph, blurry, faded, of 3 children and a woman standing in front of the rectory, and walked away without a word. That night, someone slipped a torn scrap of notebook paper under the butcher's door. She knows who wasn't evacuated. She knows what we called him. If she opens her mouth, it all unravels. By morning, the whispers ran louder than the church bells. At midday, Miss Alwyn, the retired midwife with hands like folded parchment, poured Eleanor tea in the back room of the apothecary, and said softly, "This village never feared the war. It feared the aftermath. You're not the only one who remembers who arrived here wearing someone else's shoes." That evening Eleanor was seen walking toward the woods behind the rectory, coat buttoned to her throat, a sealed letter in her gloved hand. The seal was wax red as blood and bore a crest long since removed from public records. She did not return. By dawn her scarf, the faded blue one she'd worn in every surviving photograph from the summer of 1946, was found neatly tied around the iron gate, leading to the Stratton home. By noon, Constable Ware had cordoned off the old well, muttering something about unsettled ground. The gloves were found next, one folded beneath a rusted gardening spade in Mr. Harcourt's tool shed, the other tucked under a loose floorboard in the choir loft where only 3 people still had keys. Both bore Eleanor's initials embroidered faintly on the silk lining. But they were not the gloves of the woman who arrived. They were the gloves of the girl who had vanished. The one who had once been listed as Jane Doe, age 9, in a parish ledger now turned to ash. When Miss Calder saw them, she wept not for Eleanor, but for what she herself had signed in that dim vestry office in 1947, when a man in a uniform too clean for truth had handed her a form and said, "We all need a clean slate now." Eleanor's return had never been about revenge. It had been about excavation, pulling truth from the mulch of silence, digging through decades of polite lies and scarred consciences. She had come not to accuse but to remind, and the village, brittle in its years of unspoken guilt, began to splinter under the weight of what it had agreed to forget. When the arrest came, it was quiet, just the shuffle of slippers on stone, the click of cuffs, the sigh of a man who had long ago buried his past beneath other people's names. And as the frost clung to the hedgerows, and the first crow stirred over Darnley Edge, the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of reckoning. The village had finally awoke, not to justice announced with fanfare, but to the quiet, relentless toll of memory, returning in the shape of a woman who had never truly left. They said Lorna Ainsley had returned for the estate auction, but even before her boots touched the rain-slicked cobblestones of Wexley Moor, something in the air had shifted as though the wind itself paused, and the village, with its ivy-choked fences and leaning chimneys, collectively held its breath. Nobody recalled requesting the auction, and no one could quite explain how the house on Gorse Hill, boarded up for over 16 years like a wound stitched shut, was suddenly listed as available for view. Lorna arrived alone, draped in a heavy black coat, still speckled with the brown dust of distant peatlands. Her ink-stained fingers clutched tightly around a travel case too small for a stay, and too worn for comfort. Her eyes, cold and too observant, scanned the village like someone reading the final pages of a book they'd once written. Her return didn't just spark gossip, it disturbed something older, deeper. In Wexley, curiosity was tolerated, but memory was feared. And Lorna, whether she knew it or not, was memory incarnate. She took up residence in the old schoolmistress's cottage, untouched since Miss Harrow had died under unusual circumstances, a phrase that in Wexley meant we stopped asking. By nightfall, she had already walked the Weir's edge, stood beneath the rusted weather vane that famously stopped turning the same night Alice Thorne disappeared, and asked about the church bell that hadn't rung since the spring of 1969. The spring when everything had started to go wrong. But no one answered, or rather they looked at their shoes, adjusted scarves, muttered excuses and changed the subject. That morning, as the mist lay heavy over the village, the blacksmith's widow opened her door to find a diary on her doorstep, the one she'd lost in the parish fire of 2 pages were missing, the exact 2 where she'd written about the girl with the wrong surname and the locked cellar at Gorse Hill. Her hands shook as she closed the door, not from cold but from something closer to shame. That same night, the lights flickered in the church hall. The fuse box, when examined, had been stuffed with old school uniform buttons, identical to the ones Lorna and Alice once wore. The constable blamed pranksters, but the vicar, normally chatty and full of anecdotes, went abruptly silent when Lorna passed him on the green. He simply stepped aside, head bowed, his hands visibly trembling. She said nothing to him, just smiled. It was not cruel nor kind. It was a knowing smile, the kind that made people forget what warmth felt like. The next morning, the station master's wife received a letter, unsigned, unposted but written in unmistakable script. Inside was a list of names, the same names spoken, barely whispered, on the day the will was forged. Every name was crossed out, except one, and then the drowning, quiet boy, barely 16 with no enemies and fewer friends. He was found face down near the edge of the weir, mouth stuffed with crushed rose petals, as though someone had tried to make the death look poetic. Inside his coat, neatly folded, was one of Lorna's old sketches, a pale, eerie rendition of Gorse Hill with one key difference. A second chimney cracked and hidden behind brambles, which the house had never visibly possessed. The sketch was water-stained, but something darker than ink had bled through the lines. The inquest whispered suicide. The coroner, older than he admitted, said ritual. Lorna said nothing. Instead she began to paint, every evening, by the window, always at dusk, as if waiting for the dark. Her paintings were strange, blurry, dreamlike, figures that lacked faces, a woman in a crimson shawl holding something invisible, a man whose reflection showed no features, and always in every single canvas, the bell tower of Wexley's chapel silent, abandoned, but uncannily detailed. The villagers began to murmur that Lorna had never really left, that maybe the house on Gorse Hill had never truly been empty, only waiting for her. Or worse, waiting with her. Then came the frost, thick and sudden, 2 weeks too early. Then came the howling low and strange. From the woods behind the weir, a place even children dared not explore. And then came the second body. An old man, once a church trustee, found seated in a prayer pew, hands neatly clasped, eyes wide open, and lips sewn shut with thick red thread. The stitching was precise, surgical, intentional. It was no longer possible to dismiss it all as coincidence. That night Lorna vanished. She left behind no note, no trace, except the final painting, still wet, resting on her easel. It was a room no one recognized, showing an impossible view from a window that hadn't existed for decades. A child knelt in the floorboards, one arm extended downward into the dark, as though reaching for something or someone buried beneath. When the postmistress saw it, she collapsed in tears. She confessed, then and there, that she had once signed a form during the storm of '69, the night the tower was struck. A harmless favor, she'd thought. A bit of clerical nonsense. She had sworn to silence afterward, had buried it so deep she forgot she remembered until the painting showed her truth in brushstrokes. And so the village braced, not for justice, which is loud and deliberate, but for reckoning, which is quiet and undeniable. One by one names began to rise, spoken in nightmares, etched in places no one wanted to look. The third funeral came without a body, only a stone, not new but somehow changed. It had always been there, moss-covered and unreadable, but now, suddenly, the name was clear, not carved, revealed. Lorna Ainsley had not returned to reopen wounds. She had come to show that they had never truly healed, and somewhere beneath Gorse Hill something shifted once more, something remembered and waited. The first whispers began not with a scream, nor with the clang of confrontation, but with the quiet return of a woman, whose name had long since been erased from the village's breath, uttered only in the corners of locked rooms, or scribbled in the margins of half-burned parish logs. She arrived mid-morning under a low, colorless sky, shrouded in a coat that belonged to another century and a veil thick enough to blur the hard lines of her face. Mist hung low over Darnley Vale, clinging to hedgerows and chimney stacks like a shroud, wrapping the cottages in something colder than fog. Expectation. The woman walked slowly but with unflinching direction, her gloved hands tucked tightly at her sides, as though gripping something beneath the layers, a memory or a weapon. The townsfolk, who still recalled the night of the Red Harvest Ball and the fire that followed, now called her only one thing: the archivist. Her real name had been scorched out of records, after the incident that turned Thorn House from a sanctuary into a forbidden relic, a place children dared each other to approach but never touch. When she stepped into the post office, the air changed. Miss Endley, the widow famed for knowing everything about everyone, had just left moments before, off to fetch her liniment, leaving behind a hush that seemed staged. The postmistress stiffened at the sight of the woman's wax-sealed parcel. Violet wax, a thistle turned upside down, the symbol once used by the secretive governing board of Thorn House. Parcel for Thorn House, she muttered, and even her hands trembled as she passed it over. No eye contact, no small talk. The archivist said nothing, nodded once and turned toward the scorched remnants of the village library closed since the fire of '87, the same fire that had started in the genealogy section and ended all attempts to digitize the village archive. By dusk someone had spotted her lantern flickering amidst the blackened stone where the family trees of every major Darnley lineage had once been traced. That same night, though its rope had long since been removed, the old watchtower bell rang once, a sharp, resonant cry that stirred awake the nightmares people had worked decades to forget. By morning things began to shift. Miss Calder's sheepdog, loyal for years, refused to cross the bridge at Rowan's Hollow and whimpered at shadows. The baker's ledger flipped itself to entries dated 1921, entries for names long dead. Miss Addle's mirror cracked, not from a fall but from the inside outward, spider webbing in silence as though reflecting too much truth. And then the notes began appearing. Slips of thin paper folded thrice, handwritten in ink that bled slightly into the page. Some found behind canned peaches at the grocer's, others inside coat pockets at the pub, a few horrifyingly tucked into hymnals in the chapel. I remember what you signed. She never drowned. Ink hides blood well. All unsigned, all in the same looping steady hand, unfamiliar, yet hauntingly deliberate. The local doctor whose predecessor had vanished mysteriously the day Thornhouse shut down, found a rusted second key behind the portrait that hung in his private office. The painting had always depicted a smiling man, but now his eyes looked to the left toward the fireplace, as though avoiding judgment. At the vicarage, a church ledger assumed lost in the fire reappeared in a sealed. Its final entry was dated 3 days into the future. Burial unnamed girl claimed by none, mourned by one. Only one person in the village, still living, had tended to the orphans who once lived inside Thornhouse. Miss Harwin, a nurse with thin hands and trembling lips, answered the knock at twilight. Her words were soft, broken. I knew her. She had his eyes. She handed Miss Ray, a local schoolteacher now swept into the thick of it, a letter wrapped in twine and oilskin, preserved across decades. I tried to tell them she wasn't mine, but I knew her eyes. His eyes, no signature, only the initials, J. All it took was a candle, a crowbar, and courage not easily named, and soon they found what had been hidden beneath the old chapel vaults in a sealed crawlspace mapped in no building record. The child's belongings were there, carefully wrapped, a tiny velvet ribbon, a nursery rhyme stitched in faded blue, a silver brooch engraved with the Thornhouse seal. She had not been buried, she had been erased, and now someone, perhaps many, wanted her truth to breathe. The archivist's final act was wordless. At dawn she pinned a yellowing map to the chapel door, hand-drawn, brittle, fragile with time. It bore a dozen red circles and 2 black X's. Each circle marked a lie, each X a death. Names weren't written, but every villager who looked at it knew what it meant. Before noon the wind tore it away, but not before the constable's son, barely 10, ran his finger along a line that led to the back of the schoolhouse, a place no one had dared open in years. Darnley Vale did not brace for another scandal. It braced for collapse, not of walls or hearths, but of silence, of the unspoken understandings that had kept them safe and guilty. The reckoning had not come in fire this time. It had come in ink, long dried but never forgotten. And somewhere, in a place between memory and justice, the girl with the unclaimed name was finally her. It didn't begin with her return. It began far earlier, with an absence so peculiar, it wrapped itself in the ordinary, disguised as peace. Eden Hollow, a village so still, it once timed itself by the bakery's rising dough, began to tremble without warning, not physically, but subtly. In the way old men forgot familiar paths home, in how the librarian refused to touch the 3rd shelf on the east wall, in the sudden flight of starlings that never came back. Before the woman arrived, something else had. The uneasy knowledge that something once hidden was rising again, uninvited. When she did return, she brought no luggage, only a small parcel, and a silence that spoke louder than memory. She didn't reclaim her old home, but took the Harmwell cottage, whose windows had remained shuttered since the day the parish choir found that strange black mold blooming inside. She said little, but her presence echoed, felt in locked doors that had stayed open for years, in dogs that refused to walk down Bramble Lane. Whispers began like rain on a closed window, never loud but constant. She was here before. She shouldn't be back. It's not over. Children had dreams of rootless trees and clocks that bled. Miss Alderney, the midwife no one visited anymore, was the first to say the name aloud, her voice more air than sound. The keeper, and though no one claimed to know what that meant, the silence that followed was confirmation enough. Strange things followed her footsteps, ledgers rewritten in invisible ink, names erased from plaques, the bell in the tower ringing once every night at precisely 2. On the 6th day, the town square fountain overflowed with water thick as syrup, the same amber shade as the old Cooper ink, long banned for its corrosive property. People began remembering things they'd sworn they'd forgotten, like the twins who weren't really twins, or the man who'd been buried twice but whose grave never stayed filled. The woman in grey, always calm, always watching, never asked questions. She only left answers in places no one wanted to find them. A glove folded on a pew, a mirror turned backward in the vicar's study, a note tucked behind the war memorial that read, "What you hide from others you live beside in silence." It was Miss Glanville who broke first, not with confession, but collapse. She was found in the school archives, mumbling names no one had spoken in decades, her fingers covered in dried ink and her eyes refusing to shut. Her account was fragmented, but the message was clear. Records had been altered, identities reassembled, and a man who once wore a different face had built a new life among them. The woman hadn't come for vengeance, that much was clear. Her movements were too precise, too compassionate, even mournful. She'd come, it seemed, to stop something, to prevent a past horror from being reborn beneath new soil, because the thing she had buried had not stayed buried. And now someone else, someone far more frightened of exposure than of guilt, had taken action, not to defend the truth, but to protect the illusion. The woman had not made enemies in her silence, but she had unsettled an arrangement, a delicate lie constructed with such care that even those within it had begun to believe it. Her presence threatened to unthread the story, and so she was silent. But the truth has a pulse, and Miss Alderney had said it best when she whispered. She brought the shovel, yes, but she wasn't the one digging. Miss Marlowe, quiet all this while, finally arranged a tea at the old vestry, not out of custom but to listen. No accusations, no confrontation, just silver spoons, folded napkins, and eyes that could not quite meet. As she stirred her tea, she spoke not of the woman but of what remained behind. One glove placed intentionally, one birth record corrected with tremors in the handwriting, one visit that was not farewell but warning. And in the stillness that followed, the truth revealed itself, not with screams or protests, but in the sharp inhale of a man who had held the lie for so long he had forgotten it was a lie at all. The woman in grey had vanished again, but her presence remained etched into the pathways, the weathered bricks, the echoing hush that fell over the village like snowfall no one had forecast. And now the people of Eden Hollow understood. She had not returned to haunt them, she had returned to remind them, because some secrets do not decay when buried. They wait, patient and whole, for the silence around them to crack, and when it does they speak. Thomas's glance flickered upward just once, but it was enough. Miss Na's eyes darted briefly toward the untouched tea tray, but it was Mr. Steeple who became entirely still, as if a string inside him had snapped. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, her voice as calm as a drifting feather, "that glove, it was never merely forgotten. No, it was the only voice Marjorie had left, a quiet protest, a symbol of what was lost, or rather, what had been stolen." A hush fell over the room, brittle as glass. "A glove," Mrs. Bid whispered, her voice quivering with unease. "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed, "or more precisely, its pair. One was discovered in the scorched ruins of Thomas's barn, charred and useless, but the other was folded carefully, precisely, hidden in her luggage like a message written in silence. The kind of message women are forced to leave behind when no one listens to their words." Her gaze swept across the faces in the room, some puzzled, others fearful. "But the question isn't where it was found," she went on. The question is, why was it found days later? Why there? Because it wasn't supposed to be found at all until someone needed it to be. Her tone deepened. Quiet but unyielding. The gloves were together when she arrived. She brought them both. She parted them herself. Not for fashion, not for forgetfulness, but for meaning. She was saying something is missing. Something. Or someone. The silence that followed was thicker now. Electric. It was her way of pointing to an absence. Miss Marple continued, and I understood it because women like her, and like me, have lived long enough to know what truths we are forced to hide in plain sight. A sharp breath from the corner of the room did not go unnoticed. Then there was the medal, she said, her eyes now on Miss Bid, who seemed to shrink in her chair, found pressed between the pages of a hymn book, a place of prayer, of reflection, but for a war decoration. Curious, don't you think? Mrs. Bid nodded, trembling slightly. I assumed she had dropped it, or meant to return it. Except, Miss Marple said gently, Marjorie was never awarded such a medal. Her service as a nurse was brave, commendable, but she was not in combat. This medal belonged to someone else, someone who wanted it to be seen deliberately. It was placed there, planted, not lost. The murmurs around the room grew louder. Mr. Steeple shifted in his seat, almost imperceptibly. That medal was a trick, she went on. A magician's flash of light, a distraction. It said, look over here, so you wouldn't see what was happening over there. The glove said, notice this. The medal said, forget what you saw. Together they were a riddle, one that nearly fooled us all. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. Almost, but not quite, because someone in this room underestimated how deeply a quiet woman can remember. Her eyes clear and sharp locked onto Miss Bid, and then, the torn page. There was a visible flinch from Mrs. Bid. You mentioned it once, Miss Marple said, so casually, just a scrap missing from the church's visitors' book. Harmless, wasn't it? The color drained from Mrs. Bid's face, but it wasn't torn randomly. Miss Marple pressed, voice now a precise instrument. It was removed after Marjorie had signed it, under her old name. That single signature confirmed two things: that she had returned, and that someone else had come before her, using that same name. A man. The same man who changed his identity to disappear from his past. Miss Marple now turned her chair deliberately, gaze landing softly, but unflinchingly on Mr. Steeple. He stared down at his clasped hands. She saw your signature, didn't she? She asked. Recognized it instantly. Handwriting doesn't lie. Hers was trained to remember such things, and she remembered yours. Mr. Steeple said nothing. You met her, Miss Marple continued. No malice in her voice, just certainty. You spoke, and when she left, she was still breathing. You didn't kill her then, but she knew something. She had connected the dots. Her words fell like pins in a velvet box, silent but sharp. His silence stretched into an answer. No denial, no defense. Only the slow, surrendering slump of his shoulders. I was stationed in Vienna, he finally said, voice stripped bare. Administrative post. Temporary. The work was fragmented. Chaotic. You left under one name, Miss Marple said softly, and returned under another. I had to, he whispered, eyes still fixed downward. I had to become someone else. But it was too late. The truth now lay exposed, like the second glove, no longer hidden, no longer folded quietly away. And like Marjorie's final act, it spoke louder than any scream ever could. He had always insisted it was a misunderstanding, a tragic misread of intentions, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed a memory not misremembered, but deliberately buried. She thought I meant harm, but I didn't. I did what I had to, he muttered, the sentence already unraveling. Miss Althea Gray stood in the doorway, her presence still and sharp, like a cold draft through an old house. You altered their records, she said, her voice neither accusing nor soft, simply factual, like the tick of a metronome. You turned office clerks into battlefield martyrs, men who never held rifles praised as those who bled in mud and fire. He shifted, eyes darting to the fire that crackled low in the hearth. as if hoping to lose himself in its flicker. "I gave them stories," he whispered, more to himself than anyone. "I gave them honor. You gave them lies," Althea replied. "And when the one person who remembered the truth came back, not to destroy you but to remind you, you panicked." His breath hitched, his chest rising unevenly, and she saw then that he hadn't feared Marla's return. He'd feared what her memory confirmed, that the man he had become was built on bones that weren't his to claim. "She came to speak," Althea said gently, "to explain, to forgive. But all you saw was ruin." He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The room was already saturated with the scent of guilt. She stepped forward slowly. "You thought a quiet sleep was mercy," she continued. "The tea, you mixed it carefully, didn't you? A powder, nearly undetectable. You just needed her to stop talking." And still he said nothing, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the teacup now cold and forgotten on the sideboard, as if only now realizing it had once been full. "She forgave you," Althea said, her voice softening. "Even then I think, but she wouldn't let you keep hiding behind her silence." Around them, the room seemed frozen in time, the vicar standing with hands clasped, Miss Llewellyn clutching her rosary, and Thomas Ellery still as a sculpture, only his trembling jaw betraying the storm within. There was no outburst, no grand revelation, just truth uncoiled like smoke in sunlight, impossible to catch but undeniable in presence. The fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, but Althea noticed how one shadow remained still, right where Marla had once stood the evening she returned. Older, quieter, but still carrying the past like a note folded too many times. Days later, Thomas could be seen kneeling at the edge of his pasture, where the hedge grew thick, and the air still smelled faintly of wild thyme. He planted a bleeding heart flower, just inside the gate where Marla used to pause as a girl, brushing her fingertips across the wood before entering. No plaque, no stone, only the flower, blooming red and delicate, a quiet marker where something sacred had been buried, and something unspoken finally lay to rest. It was not about justice, at least, not the kind you could name. It was about remembrance, about the kind of peace that doesn't shout but settles in slowly, like dusk after a long afternoon. And in her cottage, under the grey hush of twilight, Althea resumed her knitting, her needle slower now, more deliberate, her mind looping through moments like stitches in a scarf. Truth, she knew, didn't vanish. It just waited, silent and patient, until someone chose to look closely. Like cracks beneath wallpaper, like a pin left beneath a teacup, it lingered, and when spoken, even in silence, it didn't bring justice in the traditional sense. It brought something better, understanding, and sometimes that was enough. The train exhaled a long, tired breath as it departed the village station, its wheels groaning not with urgency, but with something more solemn, almost like regret. Only a handful of people stood scattered across the platform, each wrapped in their own silence, some stealing glances as if unsure whether to acknowledge her or pretend she had never returned at all. A few eyes followed Lydia Merton's figure as she walked away, not hurriedly, but with the unyielding grace of someone who had already endured the worst. Some looked on with veiled curiosity, others with the kind of guilt that keeps one awake at night, not for what they did, but for what they allowed to happen. She had once been the whispered name behind every closed door, the silent accusation passed between glances, the shadow at church, no one sat beside, accused, suspected, humiliated, not through confrontation but by the slow poison of suspicion that spreads until the victim becomes the story. Eventually, she had been exonerated, not because the village believed in her, but because the truth finally grew too loud to silence. And when offered the chance to stay, to rebuild, to forgive and forget, she smiled. A smile so worn it barely held shape, and gently refused. Because some places don't ask you to heal, they expect you to pretend nothing happened. The village tried to return to its rhythm, to the comforting monotony of ordinary days, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, dogs barking in distant fields, the smell of fresh bread weaving through narrow lanes. But something invisible had shifted, like a secret unburied in the middle of the night. A man was taken away, not with scandal but with a quiet firmness that said, "You know, no sirens, no shouts, just a car pulling up before dawn and an empty chair at the cafe by morning. His name was barely whispered, as if the village feared even now that the truth might stain their wall. Lydia hadn't returned to make noise. She had come back to set something straight, not through revenge but with the sharp elegance of truth. She left behind more than a suitcase. A photograph slipped into the parish ledger, a childhood drawing forgotten in an attic, but now found, a pair of gloves, one stained, one clean, placed where someone would eventually understand, each act quiet, precise and devastating in its implication. And those who had watched from behind lace curtains, once content in the safety of silence, now lingered longer, eyes narrowed not with judgment but with recognition, guilt blooming like ivy around their heart. Miss Elspeth Grey, pruning her garden roses, paused as if sensing the echo that now hummed beneath the soil, not just sorrow but reckoning. The village hadn't changed on the surface, but beneath the cobblestones and under every polite nod, there was now a fracture, thin but real. Because Lydia had reminded them of something they had buried deeper than the crime, their complicity. She hadn't shouted. She didn't need to. Her silence roared louder than any accusation. And so now, as the last trace of smoke from the train drifted into the horizon, the village stood still, not in mourning, but in awakening. The truth had returned, not to destroy, but to be seen. And perhaps, that is the quiet heart of it all. That justice, when delayed, does not wither. It waits. Sometimes in the footsteps of a girl, once wronged. Sometimes in the rustle of old letters. Sometimes in the glance of a woman, who has nothing left to fear. And now, dear listener, the question comes to you. Softly, but insistently. If you were Lydia, carrying the weight of what you knew and the silence of what they refused to hear, would you have come back to stir the dust? Or would you have chosen peace, letting the past sleep untouched? Tell us, would you have dared to wake the truth? Your thoughts matter, because they breathe life into these echoes. And if this story stirred something inside you, consider subscribing for more such quiet storms, where mystery walks hand in hand with memory, and the smallest act of truth can shatter decades of silence. Until next time, keep your senses sharp, your words thoughtful and your heart prepared, because not every whisper is just the wind. Some carry the weight of justice finally arriving.